Hi, this is Peggy Chong, the Blind History Lady, and you're listening to White Canes Connect.
Hey there, PA Federationists. Welcome to another episode of White Canes Connect, presented by the National Federation of the Blind of Pennsylvania. My name is David Goldstein. I'm the treasurer of the Keystone Chapter. Joining me today, as always, is co-host and Keystone Chapter's second vice president, Lisa Bryant. Lisa, you had a great conversation with Peggy Chong, the Blind History Lady.
Yes, and learned so much. So we first met Peggy at the Keystone Chapter. She presented at one of our chapter meetings, but it just made sense to kind of revisit with her, get an update. She's been doing some incredible work for about 40 years. She is currently the chair of the Preservation of Historical Documents for the National Federation of the Blind of Colorado. Great conversation. She's got many, many stories that she still has yet to even talk about, but we got a nice taste of what she's been doing.
Yeah, let's take a listen.
Peggy, it's nice to connect with you again. Welcome to White Canes Connect.
Thank you for having me.
First, just tell people a little bit about you, maybe a little bit about your blindness journey and how you got into chronicling the history of the blind.
I was born blind. My mother was blind. We had congenital cataracts in our family. So out of my four sisters, three of us have congenital cataracts. My mother went to the North Dakota School for the Blind. I grew up knowing the blind people in North Dakota and some in Minnesota because, they're neighboring states. I knew the blind rug weavers, door-to-door salesmen, janitors. So I knew a lot of blind adults growing up. They were not the rich people. They didn't have the fanciest houses. The rug weaver lived in a small trailer on a trailer court, and the lady who was a janitor in a hospital married to the blind door-to-door salesman. They lived in a basement apartment that was not very tall because my dad, who was over 6 feet, always had to duck in their place. They were short, so it wasn't a problem for them. But I grew up knowing these people and thinking that I kind of knew it all. Young people, they have that attitude.
Yeah.
And when I was in my late 20s, I was asked to clean out the files of the NFB of Minnesota. We had sold the Home for the Blind in Minnesota that the organization had owned and operated since 1929. It had boxes and file cabinets full of stuff. We didn't want to take it with us. So I was told to get rid of all the unimportant stuff and only move a few boxes of stuff. So I started looking through the boxes and reading a few letters here and there. What struck me was a letter from one of the members in the 1920s, early 1920s, to another talking about our blind congressman. And I had to know who that blind congressman was. After I'd finished my task, I started investigating a little bit and found that congressman was Thomas David Shaw from Minnesota, who went on to be a U.S. senator. I collected stuff for years, and then around 2000, I decided to take on, as sort of a winter project, my family genealogy. And I went to classes because I did not know how to research. This is before Ancestry.com.
23andMe.
Yeah. So, Ancestry.com was just getting started. And that's how I pushed off on some things. But people just don't realize how little there was on there at that time. And I got hooked on genealogy. And when I was getting stumped on some of my family history, I'd pull out some of the papers, files, news articles that I had on some of these blind people and thought to myself, well, let's see what I can do with them. And I have been hooked ever since. So then I started, when I was living in Iowa, I started writing more earnestly about people. I've done little bios, the gossip columns for newsletters and things like that about blind people, but never really delved into their stories till I got to Iowa. And had a couple of articles published in the Iowa History Journal and a couple of other places. When, about 2012, I tried to get a lot of different blindness publications interested in blind history. Dialogue reluctantly said, "You think you really got enough to, put a column together on a regular basis?" So I sent enough for a year and a half of articles and said, well, here's some drafts of articles that I proposed to work on. Got the history column for Dialogue magazine, and I did that until it was no longer operating in 2019. But I also started about 2015 with my monthly emails that a few followers, and then it got bigger and bigger. And so now I do a monthly email where I highlight one of our blind ancestors each month. And if you're interested in getting on my email list, just shoot me an email at TheBlindHistoryLady@gmail.com. That's all one word, TheBlindHistoryLady@gmail.com. And I'll be glad to add you to my monthly email list. I try to tell the stories about the average blind guy. I don't write about Helen Keller, Stevie Wonder. I don't write about the ones that everybody else is writing about.
Yeah.
I write about, right now, I am researching a man named George Hagopian. And I write about him because he didn't set out to become a rich man, but he did become a rich man. There were some blind guys that got pretty wealthy. He didn't set out to be a trendsetter, but just by his example and the fact that after he left Perkins, the man had no options. He didn't have much money. He was trained as a piano tuner, not something he really cared a lot about, but it was a way to start a career. However, he lived in Boston at the Perkins School for the Blind because his family had moved away when he was a young teen and left him at Perkins, so he had no family there. When he graduated, he went to the farm of the family who would take him in during the summers. The father had passed away and left a daughter there on the farm who was in her 50s. She didn't know much about chicken raising. George did. Didn't know as much either. So he had on-the-job training, if you will, but he turned that small farm and its 40 chickens into what would at one point be 300 acres and having more than 50 employees. Those are the people that I want to write about. And I want to tell the techniques that they used or didn't use, the education they had or didn't have. What about the people who went blind later in life? What did they do? Did they continue in their careers? Some did, some didn't. When I research these people, it's interesting to note that some of the in-depth newspaper articles, say when they're probably in their retirement years, the reporter will ask, what made you think a blind person could do your occupation? And often their response is, well, nobody told me I couldn't. I think that's an important lesson for all of us to learn, is that, it's really up to us.
Yeah.
What we decide to do with our life.
And I like that your work really focuses on the individual as opposed to the history within the organizations, whether it be NFB or any other, because there are stories beyond those big kind of entities. And really what I think is most impactful are the stories of, sort of average to non-average people. So I like that your work really is very individually focused. And it sounds like it started not so much as, being a history major or anything like that, but just that inquisitive spirit is what kind of got the work started. How do you now keep that going? Because I'm imagining by now you probably have some people. Are you flooded with submissions from people? You're like, hey, I know this guy that does this, or just how are you getting newer stories?
It's really interesting. I hated school. History was one of my worst subjects, but it didn't mean anything to me. When I was studying about the Revolutionary War or the Civil War in school, it didn't mean anything to me. But looking at these blind people, because I got started with the Minnesota group, these were people that some of them I knew, but most of the people I write about lived in the 1800s to early 1900s. I find that period fascinating because many of them did not have training. Many of them did not have a family to support them or have any kind of government support, because there just wasn't any at the time. And yet they were successful. And I would find a little bit more all the time and put it together. And when I was studying my family history, we were discussing what the censuses did for each year, and found out that in the 1910 census, they specifically wanted to know how many blind people were in the United States at the time. I went home and thought, well, let's see what that census has to say. And I discovered that more than 60% of the blind people in 1910 were supporting themselves. That meant that they had no charity. It meant they had no funding from a church, no funding from a family. Now, they didn't live in the conditions that we live in today. Some of them lived in a barn, which was not uncommon if you were a farmhand to live in the barn. And they would live with the sighted farmhands in the barn. Some of them lived in garages. Some of them lived in the back of their stores, their businesses. They had, a lot of them, their own businesses because nobody would hire them. Their choices were to go to the poor farm or live with family. If they didn't have that option, the poor farm or the jail, neither one of them were great opportunities. And so I started to dig into some of that. Of course, I've looked at the schools for the blind, but when I was gathering this data, I had lists of names that I still have not gotten through. And every time I am researching one person, I find 5 or 6 or 7 more other blind guys that I put aside for the next one. I don't have a lot of people calling and telling me or emailing me and saying, hey, my great uncle was blind and he was the justice of the peace in such and so a city. I don't have that much of that because we don't necessarily bring that down in our family trees. When I am reaching out to the descendants of some of these people, because blind people themselves didn't always have children, they were encouraged strongly not to by many agencies, organizations, doctors, etc. I'm reaching into the great nephews and nieces, and many of them had no idea that their relative was blind. So that story doesn't go down. When we're looking at the newspaper articles, if they were a beggar on the street, if they used their blindness to promote themselves, they might be listed in the newspaper as Blind Tom or Blind Jim or Blind Mary.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know their last name. If they were a successful attorney, if they were a businessman who served on the city council, the Chamber of Commerce, big in their church, it might give you the name, but it didn't tell you that they were blind. So you have to do a lot of digging. It's a puzzle, and I love the puzzle pieces that I get put together. So I've got piles on my desk yet that I've got a long way to get through.
Stories yet to be told.
Yes.
Tell us more about how you've seen the change in, you mentioned people who lived in, the 1900s. Are you seeing, and they had to, of course, be very creative and very ingenious in just, making their way through life. Have you seen that same sort of drive today when we do have a lot more available? We have technology, we have organizations, we have government support. Do you see that same sort of tenacity now, even with all the support? Or are you seeing a difference in, people are still achieving, but have you noticed any kind of a change in just how much easier it might be for blind people today? Or do you still see that sort of having to, kick against the grain or go I guess, kind of drive through obstacles is what I'm trying to say.
One of the things I learned in the classes I took on how to research your family was that it was important to look at what's going on around your family, what's going on in the community at that time, as well as what's going on around the country at that time. And what are the neighbors doing? We mirror society in many, many ways. I think some things are more amplified in the blind community than they are in the sighted community. But when you look at what people were doing in 1900, 1920, and what people are doing today, I think you find that in general, people were working 60 hours a week, especially if they were on a farm, where today you don't find that kind of commitment to anything. Yes, there are people that definitely do that. There are people that are working very hard. But I think that the percentage is far lower today than it was back then. I think people who had no blindness training and were living on the streets or going from family member to family member, I think that some of them felt probably more hopeless back then than people do today, because you were so dependent on other people back then, and that could go away in the blink of an eye, where today blind people, especially the younger ones, they have that cushion of SSI or SSDI, or they can get into a rehabilitation program and, for a year go in through a center and have the state pay for your living expenses or something till you figure out what you're going to do. There was not that option back then. So it's hard because you're not comparing apples to apples. It's kind of difficult to say, but I don't think that today, blind people really understand how far down our blind ancestors fell, because they were literally, some of them having very little clothes to wear because they had worn out and they didn't have any charity to go to get more clothes. I've run into that when the Home for the Blind in Iowa closed around 1900. Some of those blind people had literally not enough clothes that they owned to take a train back to their home community, because the county they were in didn't matter if they'd been there for 10 years already. They said you couldn't stay in that county. You had to go back to the county for which you had originally come from and become a ward of that county. They didn't have enough decent clothes to travel on a train without being arrested for indecency. And had to, some of them had ads, it had people put ads in their paper in their hometown to ask for clothing to be sent or money to be sent to them so that they could purchase a pair of pants or a shirt to be able to ride the train back home.
Wow.
We don't have that kind of desperation anymore.
Right.
We have situations today where our homeless people sometimes will commit a small crime to go to jail because it's a place where they can get fed for a while and have a bed. Blind people did that. They would get arrested, particularly on a Friday night, as the judge might not come to town till Monday or Tuesday. So they had the full weekend if it was going to be bad weather, to be indoors, have food, have shelter.
Yeah.
We had poor farms, and the poor farms were actually worse, many of them, than going to jail. I've documentation of several poor farms where they were large acreages fenced, and they would get all the people inside the poor farm by dusk, lock the gates, and then open them up at dawn. So once you're inside, if you were in there by yourself, chances are when you woke up in the morning, you didn't have your shoes. If you were a woman, you know, your physical safety was definitely at risk. So if you had an opportunity to be arrested for vagrancy or sent to the poor farm, you would choose the opportunity to be arrested and go to jail and have the vagrancy on your record, then be sent to the poor farm, where you might not have anything when you came out the next morning. They had a law unto themselves. That kind of desperation makes you choose something else. People would say that when facing the poor farm, they would have to make a decision to try something, anything, whether that be selling brooms door to door, whether that be signing up for a circuit that you might be the piano player and go from town to town to back up the church choir, or the educational community connections that they had. So you chose to do things just because you had to, where I don't think that desperation is in our culture anymore.
Right.
And I think that maybe takes away some of our inventiveness, that we don't have that desperation that creates some really wonderful opportunities for us.
Yeah. And like I said, not to take away any of the achievements today, but there is a difference rather. There's a difference in, like, I like that you use the word desperation. Where is your work? You talked about the monthly emails, but where is all of this breadth of work? Where is it housed? Does it include any photos, for sighted people? Just where have you been kind of keeping all of this, and in what formats?
I am self-published on Smashwords. So if you go to www.smashwords.com, like smash all the words together, smashwords.com. I have about 12 or 14 books up there. I have one book in print that is Don Mahoney, television star. Talks about
and I'd like you to talk about that when you finish this thought.
So I have those places where anyone can gain access to my work. I have not found a sponsor who will take me on and sort of underwrite putting together more documents, books, a website together with all of my material together. I would like someday to take my monthly emails and put them into a book. That costs money. And so far, I have not found anyone really willing to help me break even. So, I am published on Smashwords, and several of my books are up there. I do have my book, Don Mahoney, Television Star. It's available on Amazon and a few other places as well. Don Mahoney was a fun person to research because he grew up in the early 1900s in Texas in a family that didn't go to the doctor very much. And until the children in the family, there were several children in the family, until they started hitting their late teens, no one really recognized it. You know what? I think some of these kids don't see too well because it was a progressive eye condition. And several of his siblings went blind, as did he. He wanted to be a movie star. He had an uncle that was in vaudeville. And when Don Mahoney was 4 years old, his uncle would bring him up on stage, and sometimes Don would sing some of the songs, but he would dance and entertain the audience, and he loved the applause. He was hooked on applause since the time he was 4. He went to Hollywood wanting to be the next Roy Rogers, and he was open about his blindness. He never, was a big name in the movies, but he was an extra, had small parts. He was open about the blindness. They were open in finding ways to put tactile cues so that he knew where to stand, how to face the camera, and so on. And Don Mahoney found himself in a situation where they thought if he was willing, and he was not, they were going to make this series of movies about the blind cowboy and his seeing eye horse. Don was not interested in trading on his blindness. Hollywood was pretty much closed to him by that point. When he said no, he didn't want to do that. It's kind of like, well, fine, go away. He went back to Texas and reinvented himself. He got on a radio show doing about a 10 or 15 minute kiddie program every day. When TV came in, he got about a 15-minute TV program, which became a half an hour. And then pretty soon he had another one in another town and another town and another town. He was traveling 6 days a week, doing 6 to 8 different shows a week, flying all around the state. He kept his blindness hidden for 10 years doing that until they wanted to syndicate him. And he had to kind of come clean, partly a couple of reasons, partly because this was going to be an awful lot of stuff going on. It wasn't just the little hay bales in the corner of the shed that they had the cameras focused on, but this was going to be big TV sets and everything. Also, he had what I would call a method of traveling, of hitchhiking. He was a chatty guy, got to know everybody, and he'd say, well, where are you heading to? And they'd say, oh, I'm heading down to this hotel. Oh, hey, I'm going that way. I'll walk with you. And he'd put his arm around them and walk with them so that he could feel when they were going to step down.
Oh, my goodness.
But he was out walking a few times by himself and he tripped. And people were calling into the station going, how can you have this drunk who's drunk in the middle of the day being a role model for our kids? So he came clean and said that, hey, guess what? I'm blind. Now, because he had his successes, he did not lose his TV shows. However, in the 60s, things did change. TV shows changed a lot from 1960 to 1970, and that included children's shows. And he just wasn't changing to meet that different need. So he went on to cable, and he still continued that. But this was a man who always felt that this could be taken away from him, a lot like the other opportunities that he had earlier in his life. So he never banked on it to last forever. He had other side businesses that he did that fed into his TV career, but that if his TV career failed, he could still bank on them for other opportunities. So if you want to read the book, you can get Don Mahoney Television Star from Amazon. It's also on Bard, and read more about Don Mahoney. And I tried to, when talking to his family and talking to many of the people who remembered him, I tried to find out what it was that he did, how he did it, how he got around many different things. His wife and daughters read to him. He also hired an assistant after a couple of years, and she became his reader, his guide, everything. He did not learn Braille real well. He didn't use a cane because he didn't want people to know he was blind. He did go to the Texas Rehabilitation Agency. They told him that being a TV star was really not a reasonable profession. So he should go into vending. And he told them what they could do with their vending program and never went back.
He sounds like he was quite a spitfire. Who are some other sort of legends that really impressed you?
You know, many times it's the person that I am researching at the time.
At the they become the flavor of the month, so to speak.
You got it. But one of the things that I have been doing is getting the old records from the Colorado that were found in the Colorado Center for the Blind that dated back to 1915 from four separate organizations, actually, get them digitized and in a format where I can use them, because a lot of them were handwritten records. That's not really good for a blind guy. You can't scan that. It's not going to OCR.
Yeah.
And even when you OCR a lot of the documents from the 40s, 50s, 60s, the typeset is different than today. And you get a lot of garbage, even if it's clean, even if the paper doesn't have folds and mold or fading or bleeding, you're still going to get very interesting stuff. So it took us 4 years to get that digitized, and we're in the process of having that put up on the Colorado Digital Library, which has just started to put up small collections like what we have. And we're in the process of having a librarian help us get that stuff up there. In researching our Colorado history, it's one thing to sit there and read the minutes, but who are these people? Yeah. What gave them the ideas for what they were wanting to do legislatively? So in researching Colorado, I've learned about a man named Lute Wilcox, who was a reporter and then owned Field and Farm magazine, printing company, advertising company. Much of that time he was blind. one of the things that, you asked me about the difference between yesterday and today. Back in 1900, if you had some vision, like you could tell that the light was on in the room, or that there was a street light on the corner, you could see. You weren't blind. Where today, 2200, people didn't measure that back then. You didn't need to drive a car to get your driver's license. If you had enough vision to read some, hey, great. If not, a lot of these folks, even though they didn't consider themselves blind, would have people read to them. But Lute Wilcox, he was born before the Civil War. So when the Civil War broke out, that meant no more education for Lute. He had to go and work. Was a farm laborer. He started to work in newspapers. This guy supposedly interviewed Billy the Kid. Sometimes you gotta wonder about his stories because you kind of wonder if he made
little writer's embellishment there, maybe.
Yeah, But he became a leader in the business community and in the publications communities here in Denver. He was quite wealthy because when he retired, he actually lived another 20 years. That he was a strong financial contributor to blind organizations, but to other organizations as well. And, back then, again, no Social Security wasn't around yet. So he still had his house. And when he passed away, he left money to several people, and he must have accumulated quite a bit of wealth. He was noted in a New York biennial report for the New York Institute for the Blind as someone that they sent graduates from New York to Colorado in the late 1800s, around 1900, to learn the printing trade. So he was a blind guy, well known across the country. Kind of surprising. We also found a legislator who was a wealthy attorney in Aspen, worked for the mining companies. He went blind later in life. He wanted some kind of training. He went blind about 1910, wanted some kind of training, someone to help him. There was nothing in Colorado. There was only the School for the Blind. And because he was about 60 some years old, there was
he didn't qualify.
Nothing.
Yeah.
So he decided, well, if there's nothing here, then I have to make services for blind adults in Colorado. So he became a state legislator. He ended up joining the organization. And one of the other persons who helped craft the legislation with this blind legislator was a man by the name of Elias Ammons. Now, in Colorado, in Denver particularly, in the greater Denver area, you've got Ammons Way and Ammons Road and Ammons this and Ammons that. So the name Ammons went, who is this guy? Now, he only appears in the minutes for about 6 years, and then he's gone. So I started to look him up. And Elias M. Ammons died about 1925, which is when he disappeared from the minutes. He turned out to be the governor of Colorado from 1913 to 1915, and he had served in the state house and in the state senate. He was the founder of Cattle Congress, which is really big here in Colorado. It's going on right now. He was blind from about the time he was about 18 years old. He had gotten ill and it affected his eyes. They got a little better. He went into the newspaper business. It got to the point where he no longer could read the print at all. So he went into cattle ranching. The ranch grew, and pretty soon he's elected to the House to represent the area, to better the legislation, primarily to make sure that the railroads weren't going to cut through everybody's property and take away their land. Which is how he first got into the legislature. But here he was in the 1880s, a late state legislator, a blind guy. In 1890s, he's a state senator, a blind guy, and he gets elected governor in 1913. Did we know that he was a blind person? We had no idea there was a blind governor in the state of Colorado. If we can go through a lot of these old records, yes, we're going to find many blind people who died and were buried in a pauper's grave, that had to beg for their living. But I think we're also going to find a lot of blind people who did some really cool stuff that isn't noted. Because unless you're looking for it when you do a research on Elias Ammons, you find that he had poor eyesight. What does that mean? Who knows? They didn't call him blind. When he was governor, he was accused of being the little blind man in the governor's mansion by his opponents. Now, I think it was interpreted as just a belittlement to him. But that's really about the only references you find. He was a founder of the State Historical Society's newsletter. This man left a major mark in the state of Colorado, and no blind people knew that he was blind except for those few people in the 1920s who knew him. And these are examples of people who have done, great things. But in also the Colorado records, we found a woman who wanted to be a teacher, graduated from the School for the Blind, got her teaching certificate. No one would let her be a teacher. She started up a music studio. She wanted to go to the university and teach at the university music. They wouldn't let her. By the time she had her business going about 20 years, she was teaching the master level students who were going after their master's degree in music. Now, she couldn't go to the university and she couldn't teach at the university, but she was teaching all the teachers who were going to be teaching in the schools at a university level. I find that fascinating. That she overcame all of that.
And it's so funny that you brought that up, because that was going to be my next question. What are some of examples of, I guess maybe the more tragic cases of what someone could have been, but because they didn't have the support, because there was discrimination there, have you come across? Well, you gave us some examples of what it was like, but is there another story in particular that just kind of broke your heart because there was such potential there that just never was realized?
There are hundreds of stories like that. And some of that, it is due to like illnesses. There was a lady in Iowa, Blanche Fearing. She went to the Iowa College for the Blind, which was the name of the school for the blind. At that time, it was called a college because it went from first grade through 12th grade when most people were only going through the 8th grade in school. So it was called the College for the Blind. She completed her training at the College for the Blind. She was writing poetry and had a lot of them from the time she was 12 in magazines, was paid for some of her poetry by the time she had graduated from high school. She refused to let anyone know that she was blind because she did not want people to say, "Oh, isn't that so sweet? The blind lady wrote the poem," and never think of them again. She wanted to be able to have them say, "Wow, this book of poetry is terrific," and not think of her as a blind person. So she didn't want to do that. Her father had died just before her graduation. She decided to go to law school. She went to college, went to law school in Chicago. She had her mother there. Her mother was her reader all the time. She was in college. So her college graduation photograph of the entire class, there's two women in it. There's her and her mother. That's all the rest men. She became a lawyer in Chicago. She was one of the very first women lawyers in the country. Not the
Oh,
first
wow.
blind woman lawyer, but the first woman lawyer, women lawyers in the country. There were a few, but she was in the first several handfuls of females to break into the legal field, which I think is impressive.
Now, what year was that again?
About 1900.
Okay.
Now she died in I can't remember the exact year, but approximately 1910. And she was probably not 40 years old yet. Her law offices got a start with her sister. She only had one sister. Her sister moved to Chicago. A younger sister became her secretary. Her mother was her reader and guide and went with her to court and such. It took a while, being one of the first women lawyers, to get her legal office up and running and becoming successful. So it's just now becoming successful. And she goes on vacation, has a heart attack, and dies.
Oh, wow. And she's how old then?
She wasn't even 40 years old.
Hmm.
And, it was just kind of a really, an opportunity lost for so many. You have many blind people who, in her class alone, there was the entire class was all approximately the same in economic status. They all came from approximately the same type of family background. They all were highly competitive, all of them. None of them had a secondary disability. So when that class graduated, they were all like A students. They all were active in not just the orchestra, but the theatrical groups, community activities within Vinton. So you've got Blanche, who goes on to become an attorney. You've got another woman who goes on to work for the Red Cross and the Library of Congress until she was sort of forced to retire well into her 70s. You've got another man who goes on to have a large farm in North Dakota. I right offhand can't think of the fourth one, but the fifth student was a very promising musician, a violinist. He goes back to his family farm and gets stuck there, basically. He becomes very depressed, and at the age of about 23, he kills himself.
Oh, wow.
Another wonderful life snuffed out. Now, what makes him different from the rest? This is, I keep trying to find more about this class because they all seemed to be at graduation destined for great things. Blanche went home to her family, but her family now was in transition because the father had passed away. And so they kind of followed Blanche. The man who went into farming, men are a little different than women back in 1900. The man has to go out and do whatever. He had an opportunity to buy a farm. He did so. Oh, the other man was a piano tuner and ended up, being quite successful in his businesses. But then you've got this violinist who's won awards, who has played for money, but he goes back to his family farm. Now, were his family too stifling? I don't know that. Was it too hard for him to get into the city? Was he too afraid to move into a larger community on his own? I don't know that. But whatever it was, a few years after graduation, he took his own life.
Those are tragic examples. Tell us about how you research. Being visually impaired, what sort of issues have you run into with you maybe can get the information, or it's there, but maybe it's not accessible. Just tell us about how your research, the kind of twists and turns that you have to go through.
Most everything is inaccessible. Just
Oh
count on
dear.
it.
So the more
So,
things change, the more they remain the same, huh?
bingo. Yep. Oh, especially if you're digging around in the past, because
Yeah.
let's take Ancestry.com. I use Ancestry.com a lot.
Okay.
And Ancestry.com has done a good job of translating like census documents, military records, social security databases, so that they're accessible to me mostly.
Okay.
But if you want to look at the actual record, that's not accessible. And there are
Yeah.
other pieces of hidden documentation there that you probably want to have access to. So you either don't bother with that, or you have to find somebody to read it. I do have magnification that I use on my computer.
Okay.
Like I said, with the Colorado stuff that we were just doing, I've just spent 4 years with that. We got a couple hundred volunteers. Thank goodness for the pandemic. COVID has been good for a few things, not a lot,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
there have been some
There
benefits
were
to
some silver
COVID.
linings. Yeah, there were.
Yes, and that was that there were a lot of people at home who needed something to do
Something to do. Yeah.
and took on translating our documents so that they would
Okay.
take them from JPEGs or
Mhm.
PDFs and then put them into a Word document or a text document for us. So we got a lot of material done that way. Before that project, I told you I was into genealogy. Well, I have been a member of a genealogy society for many, many years up until recently. And one of the things that I learned, especially early on, is that things are not on Ancestry.com. You need to have somebody go to the county courthouse, the city library, the county museum, whatever, and pull this out, take down the data. And because I was a member of the Iowa Genealogical Society and one in Maryland and Albuquerque, New Mexico, I would write to these genealogical societies in the area and say, "Hi, my name is Peggy Chong, and I am a member of the Albuquerque, New Mexico Genealogical Society. Here's our website," or whatever, if they need to verify who I am. Can somebody run down from your group to the XYZ library or courthouse and look up these things for me? And you got to be specific, and I will pay the cost. And sometimes you got to send a check first, to get it started, or make a donation to the Genealogical Society. But that's what a lot of the researchers are doing rather than traveling to those places, because it's going to cost you a chunk of change to go to some of these places if they are, many states away. If you're a sighted person, you can drive maybe 2, 3, 4 hours or take a long weekend or what have you. But if you are looking, like for me in Colorado, if I'm looking for something in Maine, chances are I'm not going there for the weekend. So, you
Not until you
call
get
up.
that sponsor anyway, right?
Yeah. By the way, checks are welcome with commas. But so I've done a lot of that. Now, through Ancestry.com, after they initiated the family tree option, I have been able to reach many of the descendants or one step over descendants of these blind guys and have interviewed hundreds and hundreds of descendants about blind people in their family tree. And like I said, many go, "Gee, I didn't know he was blind." But I use a variety of tools. Chronicling America is another tool I use. A lot of it, though, is just getting down into the nitty gritty and determining how much I want to pay to get documentation. that I
Right.
know might be in a county courthouse or city library or something like that. So sometimes I have to pay for that. Then you've got to scan it, and then you've got to see if it's going to be OCRable. But I've gotten pretty good at reading some of the OCRs. Like, for example, do you know what TBO means?
No.
The.
Oh, okay.
Or TB8 or,
So that was used back in the 1900s as a, sort of like a what, an
no,
editorial?
it's when you scan things that because of the typesetting, you will get
Oh,
garbage.
okay.
And I
Okay.
have gotten pretty good at deciphering some of the garbage and figuring
I
out
see. I
what the
see.
OCR stuff actually really was. And some libraries, like here in Colorado and others, they have crowdsourcing where they opened up their membership. The library, the state library, has a membership to like newspaperarchives.com, and then ask people who use the service to then go in and make all the corrections because they can look at the screen and then type it into the OCR part and make it all pretty.
Mm.
And that's getting better and better and better. So some of the newspaper sites, not necessarily if you go through newspapers.com or whatever on their own, but if you go through what the states are doing, some of them have opened it up for many people to make those corrections and make it a lot easier to read the documents. So I use those kinds of sources. I go to the libraries, visit the libraries. I spent much of last summer going a couple of times a week to the library, asking them for, what is this? Where did this come from? What does this mean? Some of them get to know you pretty well.
I'm just, that's great that you got those volunteers, during that shelter in place time. But who are you passing the baton on to? Are you training anyone up to keep this going?
Oh, I'd certainly like to. I find that people who have a really strong interest and ask me about all kinds of questions, uh, once they find out how much work it is, they're gone.
Yeah. Yeah.
I really would love to see this become more focused on saving our history because blind history is going in the trash. It literally is going in the trash. The Iowa College for the Blind, that's the birthplace of AFB. When the Iowa School for the Deaf and Blind closed several years ago, they would not let any of the alumni, former staff, I offered, they only wanted certain state employees to go in, pick out what to save, and trash the rest. Now, they had rooms and rooms of old files, records, student projects, things not quite related to the school. The alumni from the School for the Blind that was started in 1880 or so had a lot of their records there. What happened to those records? We don't know. We think most of them were trashed. They're probably in the basement of the School for the Deaf, and no one will ever find them until a pipe breaks and ruins them all. The North Dakota School for the Blind many years ago threw away a lot of its old records. They're just gone. They are no more. And if it hadn't been for a pipe bursting at the Colorado Center, we probably would not have known about these records that were there, and many of them were destroyed by water. Minnesota has gotten rid of a bunch of its records. When you look at organizations of the blind that they come and go, what happens when they disband? The records go in the trash. I was interviewing the family of an attorney from Las Vegas, New Mexico. He left a lot of records when he passed away in about 1972, but they were in Braille. His family didn't know what to do with them. they trashed them. We hear about that from when I talk to descendants. Yeah, grandma had a lot of stuff, but it was all in those dots and stuff. And well, nobody could read it. So we threw it out. Grandma had volumes of diaries. We threw it out. We are literally losing our history every day. And it is really important that when we know of documentation about us as blind people, that we find a way to preserve it, whether it's scanning it, even if it's scanning it in a format that we can't read right now, but getting it scanned before somebody trashes it. I advised some people who, someone in their state had recently passed away, and their parents or their father had been blind and had all this stuff in the garage, and they were going to trash it. And these people had a couple of weeks to get in there, find what they wanted and get out. What they wanted my advice about what to do about it, because they didn't know what to save. They're all totally blind. What do you do? And I said, well, if I was you, I would get in there with an iPhone or an iPad or whatever and take a lot of photographs. Just because you can't see them does not mean that later on you can't find somebody else to translate them. And make sure that you're getting good photographs. And that might mean using a stand to take the pictures. When I go to libraries, for example, I've made trips to the Library of Congress. You don't have the time to read and digest the material at the library.
Right.
So just like all the sighted people there, I take the photographs and I take them home. Sighted people are doing that all the time. That is a form of research that is very common. That's a technique that I learned when taking the classes. When you're going to wherever, make sure you bring a camera and a lot of film, because this is before iPhones, take a lot of photographs, because you're not going to be able to take the originals home. Originals disappear. Take some kind of a documented photograph of this material. So I do a lot of that. Sometimes as a blind person, you don't always get it right. So I do tend to take lots of pictures that I can go home and delete the ones that aren't any good, or the many duplicates later on. It's better to take too much than it is to not take enough, or take only one and then find out that, guess what? I was shaking at the time and these are all blurry.
Yeah.
You might not get the chance to go back.
I think that's a good sort of note to encourage people to really value and cherish. I'm just thinking even of our monthly meetings, and we do take minutes and they're saved electronically, but just even something like that, we sort of take it for granted. But when we had to leave one meeting space and go to another, there still was some hard copy files, which are still being kept intact. But it's just a reminder to really value our history and even value our moments now, and to not take them lightly, and preservation.
Right. And these schools for the blind that, some of them are going away or being usurped up into another department. What ends up happening is somebody who does not know the school, who does not know the history, is in charge of tossing the stuff away. And it's important for us, I think, to make sure that we're saving a lot of that material, scanning it, putting it somewhere. And now that I'm just learning about digital libraries, I think that we have some really good opportunities to find a way to make sure our stuff gets into digital libraries and that we are a part of history. Because when this stuff is all being thrown away, our history is going away. We are no longer part of the society. We are no longer part of the community's history. We don't, this could have all been lost, and Denver wouldn't have had any history about the blind, even though it dated back to the early 1900s here in Denver, and there were a strong group of people who made many changes in the lives of many blind people. But that was all in danger of being thrown in the trash. Iowa has lost a lot of history where we had a lot of people from Iowa that went off and did many things, moved to other states, became chiropractors, attorneys, lawyers, farmers, teachers, cabinet builders, furniture repairmen, electricians. That's gone. Those news articles, those stories about them, the speeches that they gave to the alumni, they're gone. And we'll never get them back.
Well, we would love for you to have the opportunity to issue sort of a pitch or a call to action for anyone who wants to maybe submit a story, a person that they'd like to know more about, or maybe they want you to know more about, or help with the work that you're doing, or go to where your work is. So plug away, as they say.
Sounds great. Well, I have an email address. My email address is theblindhistorylady@gmail.com. Catching a pattern here. Theblindhistorylady@gmail.com. That's all one word. You can contact me at that email address, and I am glad to hear from anybody. Again, if you want to get on my monthly email list, contact me there as well. Mm-hmm. I think it's important for us to know about our blind ancestors. I have a website that I'm not that great at keeping updated, but you can check out my website at TheBlindHistoryLady.com. And of course, go to Smashwords, SMASHWORDS.com, mm-hmm. and you can do a search for Peggy Chong or The Blind History Lady, and all my stuff just pops right up. And you can learn more about some of the research that I have done. One of my the first book I put up there is called The First Things I Learned, which is some of the old profiles that I did of blind people back from even as far as the early 80s, when I would, do the gossip column, if you will, mm-hmm. or write for some of the blind publications and so on. But it also goes into some of my early research, because I started, like I said, I started about 1980 trying to find out who these people were. Wasn't mm-hmm. as easy back then. I've also got several other stories up there about blind boat builder, a blind man from South Carolina who was told he couldn't go to college because he was blind. And if it wasn't for his uncles, who were quite wealthy, who said, if you don't let our nephew go, we're not going to give you any more money. So they reluctantly let him into college, graduated, wanted to be a teacher. Nope. Can't hire a blind teacher. So he ran for superintendent of schools in South Carolina. And for more than 10 years, he told the schools what they were going to do, what they were going to teach, who they were going to hire, what their qualifications would have to be. Couldn't teach in the schools, but he could tell the schools what to do. So just a lot of interesting people. So yes. And if you have any suggestions for stories, people that you know from your past, I don't write about people who are living.
Okay.
Because they sometimes grouse when I want to tell it my way, rather than how I think it should be told, rather than how they think it should be told. So, but I am interested in knowing about blind people that you have heard about, that you have some information about. And if you're interested in starting a research project on your own, I am very willing to help people with suggestions on how to get started, how to start archiving. This isn't something that you do over a summer. This is something that's going to be a time commitment. Like I said, it took us 4 years to just get to where our stuff was in an accessible format. Now the research is starting. Now we're able to look and find out what's going on in these old documents, who was doing what. And then we have to go and find out who they were in other sources as well. So, 4 years to get this far. And this is going to go on for a long time. And hopefully I am encouraging other people here in Colorado to take it on and say, you know what? I'd like to know more about this person. I'd like to know more about this situation. I'd like to know more about this law, this program. I'm willing to help people get started. Nope, I don't hire out.
But you are also available for presentations, correct?
I am. Yes, I will be glad to do presentations for people that and organizations. I charge $75 for the first hour, and I will format a program specific to your location or your group or your particular interest. For example, you referenced talking to Massachusetts earlier.
Yeah.
I focused on Massachusetts. I have focused on piano tuning. I have focused on Washington State. So I will be glad to put a program together for organizations for a fee and tell them about what I know about the history of their area and hopefully prompt them to do some more research on their own. My real hope is that we start talking about what we did as blind people, because when you go to college to become a a counselor, a psychologist, a rehabilitation professional, you're taught about the types of eye diseases we had, the trouble people had learning Braille, We're studied medically.
Yeah.
Where is the body of research that says, here are the students that went through this orientation program or this school for the blind, and here's what they were doing 20 years later. These graduates, this person here who nobody thought would stand a snowball's chance, is now running a PR company in New York. Where is that body of research? Because let's say that you are a social worker and you have a blind person come into your office. They're recently blinded. They were the president of XYZ Bank. They want to go back and be a banker. And the social worker says, well, gee, I don't know how a blind person could be a banker. How about going into the vending program? Back to Don Mahoney here. When in New Mexico, a gentleman went blind in his late 30s. He was vice president of a bank at that time. He went blind from a major gas explosion when they were out looking at a well, an investment for the bank. It killed several people, including the bank president. He ended up taking the bank presidency on because this is during the Depression. And the vice president, the blind guy, he'd just gone blind. People liked him. So they needed to hold the bank together because they were afraid of a run on the bank and closing the bank and going bankrupt and the whole bit. He ended up being president of that bank for the next 30 years. He died one of the 20 richest men in the state of New Mexico in the 1960s, and nobody knows about him.
I just want to emphasize what you mentioned about being able to sort of tailor your information depending on your audience. So folks out there, we've got Black History Month coming up. We got Women's History Month coming up. I think that would be a great opportunity to reach out to Peggy and see how she can present some profiles that fit your groups.
And I'd like to know in advance a little bit so that I have time to really research and make it really personal to who I'm speaking to.
Peggy, this has been delightful. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoy talking about blind history.
Thanks again to Peggy for stopping by. And Lisa, one thing that she said made me laugh when she talked about Don Mahoney, who wanted to be a TV star, and they told him, no, you should go into vending. I went to BBVS wanting to be in the BEP and vending, and they said, well, it's not really happening now because of COVID, but if you submit your own proposal or business plan, you could do something on your own, and we would help with that. And I submitted an idea of being a content creator. So YouTube, podcasts, and things like that. So very similar to what Don Mahoney wanted to do, and now it's okay to do that.
How things have changed. I don't know if that's a commentary on our culture or on, how the state is supporting the BEP program or both. But Peggy is doing some terrific work. And I just love those stories. I could probably just sit under her feet for hours. So thank you for her commitment. And hopefully there's some others out there that want to help her keep this going.
It really is a lot of great work that she's doing. I also got a lot out of her ideas, not just for doing the history of the blind folks bit, but the genealogy part. I'm very interested in my family history, and she gave me a great couple of ideas to take away and now try. Obviously, the one thing is, even though we might not be able to see it when we photograph a document when we're in person somewhere, what a great idea that you can always go back to it and have, if you can't have OCR take care of it, you could always have a sighted person help you out and maybe go through it.
Absolutely. So we want to remind people about our new monthly digest that is coming out, where we will have all of our events going on at the different chapters, whether it's a fundraiser, meeting, birthdays, all of that information is coming out. Stacy is doing a fantastic job of compiling all of that and getting it out. If you do have something you'd like her to put in the digest, she can be reached at stacy.leap@gmail.com. She is asking for all information to come to her by the 29th of the prior month. Of course, that excludes February. So be sure to take advantage of that.
Yeah, you really want to get, if you've got a fundraiser going on within your chapter or division, you really want to get the word out, because it's only going to get more popular if more people know about it.
So, are you excited about Washington Seminar?
I am really looking forward to it. It's been a couple of years since we've been down there. I know that our Pennsylvania delegation, if you will, is not as large as it used to be, but it is going to be a lot of fun talking and getting our points across to members of Congress and telling them what's important to us this year. And sometime in February, we'll have a recap of what went on. I'm going to have a recording device with me. I'm not quite sure what it's going to be yet. So I'm hoping that I'll have at least some clips from things that go on with the representatives and senators down in Washington at Washington Seminar at the end of the month.
Sounds like things are returning back to normal, which is a very, very good thing, because it's nothing like getting right in the faces of these legislators.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And speaking of contacting and getting in people's faces, we need you to get into our face and tell us what you like, what you don't like, show ideas, stories, anything, tips that might help somebody else, either in their house or when they're out and about. Reach out via phone, 267-338-4495. You have up to 3 minutes. Leave your name or a nickname and your town when you leave your message, and we will air it on an upcoming episode. Again, 267-338-4495.
And you can always email us at whitecanesconnect@gmail.com.
Lisa, you did a great job interviewing Peggy, and it was a very interesting interview.
Thank you, David.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
Bye now.